dividers keep on dividing. Donald Trump today losing the battle between his teleprompter self and his Twitter self, lashing out earlier today against President Obama, who yesterday warned Americans to, quote, reject language coming out of the mouths of any of our leaders that feeds a climate of fear and hatred or normalizes racist sentiments. President Obama's warning came around the same time as new reports emerged from the New York Times about the Trump 2020 campaign's use of Facebook ads to amplify the president's claims of an invasion of immigrants, the exact language invoked by the El Paso killer. And as Trump prepares to travel to the cities still reeling from the weekend violence, the Washington Post's Greg Miller reports via Twitter, quote, there is deep concern among national security officials and experts that Trump not only incites the far right with his words and policies, but impedes the government's ability to respond. And as with the president's constant contradictions of the U.S. intelligence community on the Russian attack, we now have a growing body of Trump language on white supremacy that strikes a decidedly different tone than that of law enforcement. Listen to the President of the United States on white supremacists.
I don't know anything about David Duke, okay? I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists.
Would you repudiate David Duke?
Sure, I would do that if it made you feel better. I would certainly repudiate. I don't know anything about him.
I don't know what group you're talking about. You wouldn't want me to condemn a group that I know nothing about. I have to look.
I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides.
I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess if you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet.
How about that? That is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us at the table, executive editor for Bloomberg Opinion, Tim O'Brien, the host of Saturday Night Politics here on MSNBC, Donnie Deutsch is back. Also joining us, White House reporter for the Washington Post, Ashley Parker, NBC News correspondent Julia Ainsley's here, and Washington Post senior political reporter Aaron Blake is back. Let me start with you, Ashley Parker. You and your colleagues have a great piece about the battle between teleprompter Trump and Twitter Trump. Most people feel that Twitter Trump is the true Trump. It didn't take long from when your story posted for the president's id, if you will, to emerge on Twitter this morning.
Yeah, that's right. What was so striking about watching his speech yesterday was that at this point in his presidency, anyone who has been following him closely understands President Trump can stand up and read words from a teleprompter, although he did have that Toledo flub, it's worth noting. But he can deliver a speech. And so what you sort of had was this version of himself, the scripted version, the version that aides want to portray in these moments, offering what was frankly a repudiation of Trump in other forms, himself on Twitter, his comments in rallies, his general behavior, the way he spoke during the campaign. And it often follows a pattern that, as we saw emerge today, he will sort of give the scripted thing. It sometimes looks like a hostage video, and then he will be unhappy with the coverage. He will feel forced into it, and he will begin again to lash out on Twitter and at rallies and in other comments. And so he'll sort of say a bit of everything, but the truest version of himself often, as actually Tim said in our story, is Twitter Trump.
Julia Ainsley, it'd be funny if it weren't so tragic and if lives weren't at risk. You and your colleagues have a story up for us. We have a problem. Federal agencies scramble to fight domestic terror with limited resources. Take us through the current limitations on our federal law enforcement agencies in fighting domestic terror, which is what the El Paso shooting is now being prosecuted under.
That's right, Nicole. So that quote came from a DHS official yesterday after he and others at DHS were scrambling to try to get information out to local law enforcement agencies. This is a prime mission of DHS, to be able to flag to them any emerging trends or threats that they're seeing. One of those could easily be the Facebook groups where a lot of these hate speeches are propagating, and then they go off to carry out, like you saw in El Paso. The problem is that DHS in the past 2 years has had some drastic cuts to the very programs that would be used in order to get out this information to local law enforcement. For example, they completely reassigned all of their domestic terrorism analysts. These are the people who worked with the FBI to come up with these threat assessments. They also have a new office that deals with domestic terrorism prevention, but it's much wider than just domestic terrorism and much wider than terrorism at all. And it went from $20 million in the old office down to a $2.6 million budget with just 8 people assigned to this wide mission. And the other thing they've done is they've cut funding to local prevention groups. This would be like a group we talked to in Nebraska that helps public health workers work with people to see what might be some of the warning signs so that they can get help for them and talk to their families before they become radicalized, whether they be influenced by a domestic group or a foreign terror group. If they are about to take some sort of extreme action because they've been under the influence and they've been influenced online by an extreme group, they can get out to them. Those funds stopped for those groups in July. So no longer are those local prevention groups getting that funding. So while the president is going out and saying that he wants to invigorate agencies to come together and stop this problem, the money, Nicolle, it simply isn't there to carry those things to fruition.
Aaron Blake, it's more than a money problem, though. Your colleague Greg Miller tweeted something that caught my attention today, mostly because of his body of reporting on the incredible challenge that the intelligence agencies had in fighting the Russian attack with a president who destroyed notes and only had Russian interpreters in the room when he met with Vladimir Putin, among other things, and his incredibly well-reported book as well. So when he tweeted this, it caught all of our attention here. There's deep concern among national security officials and experts that Trump not only incites the far right with his words and policies, but impedes the government's ability to respond. I think I said this last night on our special, if I were an algorithm, if I were a computer, and it were my job to go ding, ding, ding when there were intersections between Donald Trump's Twitter feed, Donald Trump's MAGA rallies, and the words that show up on white supremacist websites, or in this case, the manifesto from the killer in El Paso, there'd be a whole lot of hits.
Yeah, and there are lots of parallels to how the president has talked about issues with regards to the intelligence community, especially issues with regards to Russia. I also think it was really telling a little while back last month when Christopher Wray, the FBI director, was asked about domestic terrorism arrests since October. And he said that a majority of those arrests since October in this fiscal year were actually having to do with white supremacy. There were ways that he could have massaged that comment to maybe not make it such a big headline, but he seemed to be sending a little bit of a message that this was an issue that needed to be dealt with. And you know, certainly that's the kind of thing that people who work for President Trump in roles in law enforcement, in intelligence community, have been, you know, reluctant to maybe look like they were saying something that the boss wouldn't like. Christopher Wray seemed to have a concerted desire to put this on the map. And I think the fact that those words came shortly before what we saw this weekend in El Paso, it really was some striking timing.
Striking, and I guess, Tim, here we go again. The intelligence community had to fight an attack on our democracy from Russia with one hand tied behind their back, with a president who stood in Helsinki and said, I don't know. I don't know about all those intel guys and gals. You know, Putin's real strong. Putin, after the Mueller report was received, after Donald Trump heralded it and then unheralded it, was sitting next to the president. The press asked him if he was going to ask Vladimir Putin to stay out of our elections, and he did it glibly and as a joke. We now, and I accept Aaron Blake's analysis of that, Chris Wray didn't have to underscore the threat of white supremacy. We now have law enforcement fighting a fight against white supremacy when the white supremacist messages are in ads that were paid for. The Trump campaign bought ads on Facebook with the same attacks on immigrants that are in the killer's manifesto, the invasion claim. President Trump's re-election campaign has harnessed Facebook advertising to push the idea of an invasion. at the southern border, amplifying the fear-inducing language about immigrants that he has also voiced at campaign rallies and on Twitter. Since January, Trump's re-election campaign has posted more than 2,000 ads on Facebook that include the word invasion, part of a barrage of advertising focused on immigration, dominant theme of his re-election messaging.
So the conclusion to draw from that is they know exactly what they're doing. And, we've talked a lot about the idea that Trump doesn't think strategically. He's a visceral operator. And I think generally that's true. He's also a salesman and a marketer at his core. And he understands the power of repeating things time and again. And I have a hard time believing that that particular Facebook campaign with a focus on the use of the word invasion didn't have his hands in it somewhere. Remember before the midterms when he kept highlighting the caravans?
Yeah.
The caravans are coming, the caravans are coming. And it was like War of the Worlds. He might have been Orson Welles doing a War of the Worlds broadcast. These aliens from outer space are coming to your border and they're going to take over your country. He revels in this, and I think that that's beyond just his irresponsibility here and his lack of humanity. He's weaponizing racism here. It really distinguishes him from, certainly from every other president of the modern era who's been judicious about the language they've used, even if they haven't been friendly to people of color or minorities. They haven't flagrantly weaponized the language. And we've said for some time, what is the outcome of all that going to be? And I think the reason this weekend has captured people's imaginations and hearts and concerns is because this is the outcome of the kind of language Trump uses and the kind of campaign he ran as president and the kind of campaign it would seem that they're intent on running again.
Donnie.
I want to go back to my business CEO guy. I just play a journalist on TV. At my core, I'm a business guy. And when I was running an agency, I get brought in to solve problems. So to me, beyond the obvious outrage and probably that a couple of solutions I was thinking about, because to me, unless we get rid of Trump, McConnell, and assault weapons, in one form or another, this continues. It just does. That we cannot live in a society where there is a product that exists that its sole function is to kill people in masses. It doesn't happen. And 87% of the fatalities come back to assault weapons. So having said that, putting all three of those things together, what I would recommend for the Democrats is hopefully the one leader that stands up and says, from here on in, 10% of every donation to my campaign goes to a fund. I'll quit my job here and manage this business of getting rid of assault weapons. And every candidate running for Congress, Senate, President, by the way, competitively they'll stay the same because everybody's giving, you'll end up with a pot of maybe $500 million out of that. And at the same time, start something called Assault on Assault, where every American just give $5. Get a war chest between $500 million and $1 billion. Give it to me. I'll leave this network. I will start to move that needle because a lot of it is about money. The other thing, the media has a job here at this point. Trump is the Don of hate. I love my good friend Joe Scarborough. Came up, Moscow Mitch, fantastic. And I'd like to kind of try and get to Trump. It's not even about racism, it's about hate. Take it to one step further. The greatest word we have, I don't want to sound like Marianne Williamson in our language, is love. The most universal hated word is hate. We cannot let go of two pieces that 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, he tweeted and stood up, send them back to immigrants or to people of color. And then 2 weeks later, in a manifesto that mimicked just about everything, there was a slaughter. That's a fact. There is no greater articulation of hate. If the media keeps alive that story and does not let the parade pass, there's not a political issue now between 2020 that I as a marketer could not somehow tie back to that story. Let it live every day. At the same time, let's raise close to $1 billion to ban assault weapons. Between those two, we will get those two jerk-offs out of office, and we'll be in a position, even with them out of office, to start to solve a problem that has to be solved.
Ashley Parker, let me bring you back in on some of the voices that have been reluctant, I think, to engage Trump in the news cycle. Susan Rice, his former national security advisor, she's got a piece in the New York Times today. She writes, most dangerously, President Trump is serving up to our adversaries an ever more divided and weakened America, one that is animated by suspicion, arrived by hatred and the other, and increasingly incapable of uniting in the face of external threats. Russia, above all, continues to exploit and exacerbate these divisions. Our domestic fault lines remain our greatest national security vulnerability, and race our oldest and deepest rift. And obviously, as we said in the intro, President Obama, who's been very reluctant, maybe the only person more reluctant than President Obama is my old boss, former President George W. Bush, to step into any of sort of the political crossfire. Both of them weighing in. Is there a sense that this is different?
Well, I think especially President Obama weighing in was just so striking because you're right. He almost never says anything. And that was kind of his ethos, was that he's no longer president and he's going to step back and let the next leader do what they want. So although he didn't name President Trump in that statement, it was very clear who he was talking about, very clear the language he was talking about. And I think this may, at least on the Democratic side, be different. It wasn't just those two individuals. It's just about every single candidate who is saying something. And I know some on President Trump's, his allies are saying they're, using this for cynical ends to try to reboot their campaigns or for political ends. But if you actually look at the Democratic field, a lot of these candidates, because we have been living with mass shootings for so long, back to Columbine, they have a personal connection to this. They have a nephew who was gunned down. They were born in the town El Paso where this massacre occurred. I mean, this is an issue that it's not just a political issue. It's not just a national security issue. At this point, just about everyone in this country has been touched by gun violence or knows someone who's been touched by gun violence in some way. And I think you are seeing that animating the discussion, at least on the left.
Also, the divisions reaching a boiling point of concern for a lot of former elected officials. Julia, let me read you something else Greg Miller tweeted about. There's actually a Russia nexus here, isn't there always? Russian trolls amplify hate, white nationalism message to divide U.S. Trump's refusal to acknowledge Russian interference enables it to persist. I know we live in dog years of news cycles. Donnie makes a good point that nothing stays around. But I think if anyone remembers any headline from Mueller's testimony, it was when he answered Republican Congressman Hurd and said, while we sit here, Russia's still at it, and these divisive messages are exactly the Russian attack is the what is these kinds of messages of racial division.
Yeah, I mean, you can see these messages that when we first heard the details that Robert Mueller laid out in his indictment of 13 Russians and how they attempted to influence the U.S. election. I think a lot of Americans read that and said, well, I couldn't have been influenced. I see something on Facebook that's not influencing. But I think that there is a slow creep into our culture that you can see, whether it's through election interference, whether it's through hate speech online, and in a number of ways. And I'm just so struck by the way law enforcement has to put all of these things in different buckets. So something like a divisive tweet that comes from a Russian bot, that would go into a counterintelligence bucket to figure out where that's coming from and how they may be trying to influence elections and into election interference. If it came from something like an Islamic extremism group, you could start taking action against people involved in that, even if they're doing something as small as just driving someone to the airport who may then go on to carry out an attack, because we have material support statutes. That does not exist if you're talking about hate speech that is focused on a U.S.-born ideology like white supremacy. We do not keep the same list of hate groups that we would for foreign terrorist organizations. So really, the way our laws are written, it keeps people in the FBI and the Justice Department from going after that kind of speech and the people who were spreading that kind of speech in the same way they would if it came from an extremist who had a foreign ideology. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. And so when we see things like El Paso, we talk about domestic terrorism, we don't even have a domestic terrorism statute. And so we feel at the end of the day, we're left wanting more reaction, more in the terms of prevention. But really, our laws just aren't set up that way right now.
But Aaron Blake, the laws all changed after 9/11 because the enemy was Islamic terrorism. All the laws changed. I worked in the White House, and the first thing that the White House did after they grounded all the planes and went about the business of the first response was to change all of our laws so that the war against global terror was fought with totally different weapons. I'm struck that no laws are even being discussed to be changed. No one's even talking about arming the FBI with the same kinds of tools to fight what the FBI called domestic terror in the same way that the FBI fought Islamic terror. Am I missing something? Are there secret conversations going on in Washington about the new face of terror? Or is it as Julia Ainsley accurately describes? One piece of evidence goes in one bucket. Chris Wray testified right before Robert Mueller was on Capitol Hill and said, hey, there's no apparatus for us to even get involved with white supremacy until there's violence. If we fought the war on terror like that, we may all be dead.
Well, there's a reason why there's not really any discussion of this, and that reason is the person in the Oval Office. Republicans, they're having a tough enough time talking about white nationalism, talking about white supremacism, talking about the manifesto that the shooter allegedly wrote in El Paso, taking things a step further and talking about expanding domestic terrorism laws. It's not difficult to see how that could be cast as something that is highlighting the president's rhetoric. That's not something that's difficult to separate from, the fact that the president can't even talk about these things or struggles to talk about these things when he's not on a teleprompter. So until we see the president sign off on some kind of an approach like that, we're just not going to see the Republican Party even entertain these kinds of things. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see Democratic presidential candidates start talking about this. I wouldn't be surprised if them say, they start talking about how this is one of the reasons that we need to get the president out of office, because this is something that we can immediately start talking about doing, given that the evidence is clear that there is a rise in white supremacist violence and terrorism in this country, as told to us by the FBI director for President Trump.
I never thought I'd live long enough to see Democrats gain the upper hand.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.